Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 5th of January 2016. Welcome to UK Column News. Time just after 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
You thought I'd missed it, but I hadn't. Well, the weather is bright and sunny. Those dark rain-filled clouds in Plymouth have broken away. We've actually got some blue sky and sunshine. And the reports across the country are quite encouraging. So Rhyl and the Rhondda, southeast London, all talking about some sunshine. Still wet in Manchester. And we haven't got any reports today from north of the border. But at least we can see some blue sky.
Yeah.
Can't be bad. Well, of course, money makes the world go round. The corrupt corporate banking institutions continuing to dominate politics, really. What have you got, Mike?
Well, Financial Conduct Authority, we touched on yesterday that 2016 is clearly the year of banker love, and this continues. We've got Mark Carnage and George Osborne at the end of last year, from the middle of last year, both believing that we should love bankers, and that they've each been running their own anti-banker bashing PR campaigns. So now after the 2008 crash, the Financial Standards Authority was scrapped because they didn't see it coming. It was split in two, perhaps as the bank should be, and the regulatory part became the Financial Conduct Authority under the control of the Bank of England. So it's perhaps no surprise that on the last day of 2015, the FCA shelved its plans to hold an inquiry into the culture, pay and behaviour of staff in banking. Now, anybody that knows any bankers or staff in banking, the type of banking that we're talking about, of course, is the casino banking that caused the problem in the first place, knows that any investigation into the culture of staff in banking and the behaviour of staff in banking isn't going to result in much, probably, but nonetheless, it would have been nice to have it. The Treasury apparently has denied any involvement in the decision not to hold this inquiry, and the FCA have said that it had decided that a traditional thematic review would not help, and that it
Sorry, Mike. Yeah. I just had to chuckle. We're going to be talking about Newspeak in some other areas. So,
yes.
So
anyway, yes. So that wouldn't help, and certainly wouldn't help achieve its desired outcomes. And they promised instead to encourage, quotes, delivery of cultural change. So today, excuse me, as you might expect, a number of MPs on the Treasury Select Committee have had enough. They're calling for a hearing. They're inviting the FCA in to answer questions over why they've come to this decision. Well, maybe that's just as well. It seems increasingly apparent that the FCA really isn't regulating anything anymore. They've now closed their investigation into HSBC, who, of course, it was discovered at the beginning of last year, had been helping their customers avoid tax. But they've decided that they have no remit for investigating the behaviour of HSBC under these circumstances, because the FCA doesn't regulate tax avoidance issues apparently, and it's not responsible for regulating HSBC's Swiss arm. But of course, the FCA is supposed to be responsible for regulating any bank, its behaviour globally, even if it's operating within the United Kingdom. So basically, the FCA not doing its job, as far as I can see, shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And until we actually split up these banks and end the too big to fail sort of situation, we're just going to be at their mercy.
Is it not doing its job, or is it doing its job very well by covering up and obfuscating what's going on?
Well, your opinion on that is really based on what you think the purpose of the FCA is. And I think it's a combination of the two, depending on your point of view, I suppose.
Okay.
So what's next?
Well, I've picked up on just some of the reports to do with Iraq and Syria. And what I find quite amazing is that we've got these, I'm going to call them violent headlines, some of them really quite offensive, throwing a whole range of topics to do with Syria and Iraq. So this one from the Mail, we've got migrant husband allowed people smugglers to rape his wife daily for 3 months as payment for trafficking. really unpleasant, very emotive article. What's the objective? Is the objective cold calculated exposure of people trafficking and all the horrors that comes with that? I'm not convinced. I think this is something to do with corrupting people's minds over what's really going on. Let's bring in another one. This is Ramadi here. This is a picture of a liberated city. So once Western powers have got involved in your country and a bit of time's gone past, this is what it looks like after various bits have been liberated from supposedly Islamic State, although could be ISIS. It's job to say really in this one.
Do you think Roger's Thesaurus could be sued? Because I'm pretty sure if I look up the word liberated, I'm not going to find any kind of synonym that represents this.
Well, one of the things we're going to mention in this news today, Mike, is the use of language, and it's becoming quite clear that across government and the public sector, we're breaking away from traditional English. We're into newspeak, and that newspeak is simply designed to get the propaganda message across. So I don't think we're going to be looking up any books. Let's just add another one to this one. We always need a child in order to get the message across, and we're to believe that this young man was taken into Syria by his mother from family. I think they were in Deptford in London, and he's now been used in propaganda, 4-year-old used in propaganda videos. But as you look through this, I've gone hard on the Mail, but it's across all of the mainstream. It's a sort of collage of these vile reports. Where does it take people's minds and analysis as to what's going on? I think it takes them into a no man's land.
Actually, maybe this is a bit of a clue then, because this is Syria's lost refugee children. Urgent government response needed. This is according to the International Development Committee. And they're urging the government to back Save for the Children's proposal of accepting an additional 3,000 refugee children within Europe. This is in addition, apparently, to the current commitment to resettle 20,000 refugees in the region. Now, Stephen Twigg is the chairman of the committee, and he said that children are clearly some of the most vulnerable refugees this crisis has created. The committee heard that close to 80% of Syrian child population already need humanitarian assistance. And of course, he's then calling on more children, unaccompanied children, to come to the UK. And one of the things he said was, having survived the treacherous journey, there's a grave possibility that unaccompanied children become the victims of people traffickers who force them into prostitution, child labour and the drugs trade. And he says this is an issue of utmost urgency. And really the question that I have for Stephen Twigg then is, if in order to prevent this people trafficking, this prostitution, this child labour, this drugs trade, if in order to prevent that, he is calling for the government to bring unaccompanied children into this country, what is he personally going to do to make sure that those children don't end up becoming victims of people trafficking, prostitution, child labour and the drugs trade in the UK? Because I think, bearing in mind the current regime that we've got in this country, we're very, very likely to see exactly that happening.
Well, we are seeing that happening, Mike. It's happening through every sector where the British state is handling children. So at the moment, it's all gone very, very quiet on the so-called Goddard inquiry. We're going to be mentioning Devon and Cornwall Police in a few minutes, a little bit of history with them, but of course they refused to investigate a child abuse case. And we've also understand that Manchester Police have now pulled out of an investigation into abuse survivor Vicky Ash. So wherever we look, the state refuses to carry out proper protection of children. Why? Because it's quite clear that the state itself is involved in the abuse of children. This would represent a steady supply of children from Syria, so in my opinion.
Perhaps Mr. Twigg would like to comment on how he's going to protect these children if they do come into the country.
Well, perhaps that would be a good comment if any of our viewers or listeners would like to send a polite and short email to him to ask that very question. We'd be very interested in the reply.
In the meantime, of course, we've had this continuous rumble of stuff regarding chemical weapons in Syria. And this is the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, who are apparently gravely concerned about the continuing use of chemical weapons in Syria. So I'll just read this out. It says, in a meeting today, the Executive Council of the OPCW adopted by consensus a decision expressing grave concern regarding the findings of the fact-finding mission that chemical weapons have once again been used in the Syrian Arab Republic. The Council reaffirmed its condemnation in the strongest possible terms of the use of chemical weapons by anyone under any circumstances. It emphasised that any use of chemical weapons anywhere at any time by anyone under any circumstances is unacceptable and would violate international law. The Council expressed its strong conviction that those individuals responsible for the use of chemical weapons should be held accountable. Now that, of course, is all very laudable, but the point here is that once again, they do not manage to provide any evidence as to which chemical weapons have been used, who has used them, and where they came from. And the problem here is, because this is couched in such vague language, it's very likely that this gives the opportunity for anybody that feels like it to just start blaming anyone that they feel like blaming. So where does this actually get us? They claim that they found evidence of continuing use of chemical weapons, but they don't say who's used it or under what circumstances. But I suppose a piece of good news from the same organisation, because they are also highlighting yesterday the fact that the last chemical weapons that were removed as a result of the voluntary giving up of stores by Assad's regime, the last of those have now been destroyed. So I suppose that is a good piece of news on the Syrian situation. But in the meantime, we still aren't getting any clarity on who is using what and where.
No, it's a morass. People are taken into a morass where it's impossible to see what the real truth is, and there's no proper investigative reporting and analysis to look at it, which allows people like Brooks Newmark, of course, to make a statement that it was fact that Assad had used chemical weapons when there was no evidence at that time, and still is no evidence that that was the case.
Yeah.
So it's really drawing people's minds into this space where you're not sure what's true and what's not.
Yeah.
Well, what we do know has come out of all this is, of course, that the fear over terrorism has been ramped up. And Ian Crane had a particularly powerful programme last night. Obviously, he was talking about fracking, but he was also talking about the fact that he seems to have become one of David Cameron's primary terror suspects. So Ian Crane informed us last night that he'd been stopped at Exeter Airport before Christmas. He'd been returning from giving a talk in Holland. What was that talk about? It was about fracking and the environmental dangers of fracking. So as he's collecting his baggage at the airport, two gentlemen sidle up to him and ask if they can speak to him. When he says, "Who are you? What about?" They identify themselves as Devon and Cornwall Special Branch. They want to talk to him about matters connected to terrorism, and he's taken into a side room and he's detained for about an hour and questioned on whether he's an extremist or connected with extremism. Now, UK Column and many other people have been warning about the dangers of David Cameron's new anti-terrorism policy and his so-called prevent strategy. Of course, he says this is aimed at Islamic fundamentalists, Islamic extremists, but some of the mainstream press did also warn that, of course, the rules are so vague that other people were likely to be caught in the net.
In fairness, Ian does have a beard.
He does have a beard. It's not black though, Mike. So, but we need a little bit of humour in this because this is so serious. But here is a man who's been speaking out on fracking and environmental issues. Certainly one thing Ian Crane has never done publicly or privately is advocated extreme behaviour in dealing with any of the issues that he's raised. But this is what happens. He is given a form. This is a form Schedule 7 to the Terrorism Act 2000 Notice of Detention, a Tact 2 form. Now, we've spoken to some informed police officers involved who've had experience of terrorism. They didn't recognise this form, but this is it completed and subsequently given to Ian Crane. If we just break down some of the form, this bit Ian was keen to bring to people's attention that these two police officers also took his mobile phone to examine it while he was being held effectively captive and interrogated at Exeter. And then they calmly said, well, they've taken a copy of the phone. Ian asked them what they downloaded it onto his phone. Of course, this is the risk. Once the police take your phone, you have no idea of what information, viruses or programs have been put on that phone. And they did annotate the form at the top. They didn't want to give any names, so we're into secret police. All they would give is their warrant numbers, so 5300 and 5912. Signature of detained persons. Well, Ian Crane clearly refused to sign the form, and this form says that it's supposedly secret when complete. We find this particularly interesting because that would mean the form had to be accounted for in an audit, security audit process, but there's more to this form than meets the eye. Let's have a look at this, which is just astonishing. Do you want someone informed? You may, if you wish, at public expense, have a fried. We'll put that in larger text. You may, if you wish, at public expense, have a fried, a relative or a person who is known to you or is likely to take an interest in your welfare, informed that you are being detained here. So you look at this, is this just incompetence, Mike? This is supposedly a form being given out, presumably, to many people whose English is not their primary language. It's supposed to be an official Devon and Cornwall police form, and we've got major spelling mistakes which actually interfere with the meaning of the form. Is this incompetence, or is this perhaps not a real form?
I think that's much more likely, isn't it?
Well, we don't know. As we say, we did ask for some opinion from a retired police officer, and their opinion was that there was something extremely strange with this document, and indeed the manner by which Ian Crane was detained. But let's remember where this has come from. Let's go back to David Cameron's Birmingham Nine Stars school speech. This is where he put forward his plans to address extremism. And we've just taken some of the text off the government website here. Roots of the problem. We've got to understand the threat we face and why we face it, what we're fighting in Islamist extremism. And if you go through his text, of course, that extremism, nothing to do with countries being destroyed by David Cameron and his predecessors in the Middle East. No. This is simply they hate us for who we are. It's subversive. It seeks to destroy nation states. Remarkable at the moment, Mike, that we've got both David Cameron's government and, of course, America discussing the revision of borders for Syria now. We're going to take Syria as a nation state. The borders, well, they didn't really mean anything, did they? They were just...
That's right. They were an early 20th century construct. And so who is actually discussing destruction of nation states?
Would seem to me Mr. Blair and David Cameron and President Obama. But let's carry on through. It says you don't have to support violence to subscribe to certain intolerant ideas which create a climate in which extremists can flourish. So presumably, if you dare to talk about the dangers to the environment of fracking, even though what you say is perfectly reasonable, that could draw in extremists and then you become an extremist.
Yeah.
Okay, let's carry on through. Ideas which are hostile to basic liberal values such as democracy, freedom and sexual equality. So if you say anything which counters David Cameron's opinions on democracy, freedom and sexual equality,
yeah,
This is the thing. This is a very, very vague document. And let's get down to the bottom. It says ideas like those of the despicable far right, which privilege one identity to the detriment of the rights and freedoms of others. And so there's David Cameron talking about the despicable far right, which privilege one identity to the detriment of the rights and freedoms of others. And into my mind came his close friend and ally, Oliver Letwin, because it's now emerged. What was Oliver Letwin say? Well, those nasty black people, it's their attitude that's the problem. Isn't that right-wing extremism?
I would say so. But I would say Cameron's protesting a bit too much here.
Right. He's protesting too much, but the reality is that we've now got members of the British public arrested, detained at airports, accused of being terrorists simply because they dare to speak out about David Cameron's policy, not over political matters, but on the subject of the environment and fracking. This is very, very dangerous stuff. Well, here's David Cameron. The Guardian picked up on his 4 pillars of counter-extremism strategy. What did he promise? Well, he promised this: to introduce narrowly targeted powers to tackle hate preachers and cult leaders who promote extremist views and material. So presumably Ian Crane is now what? A cult leader, or is he a hate preacher?
Both, perhaps.
Both, because he dares to challenge David Cameron's policy over destroying Britain's countryside through the use of fracking. So let's bring Ian Crane back into the picture in that document. The reality is that we've got a direct attack here on individual and public freedoms and free speech, and the right to expose government policy presenting a danger to the British public. This is the reality of where David Cameron is taking. This is corporate fascism on reheat, Mike.
Yeah, and of course it's much worse than just free speech, because what you showed earlier was all about ideas. You can't have an idea which threatens my idea is unacceptable. So it's really thought crime we're talking about here.
Thought crime. That's absolutely what it is. Well, we just thought, as always, we'd take a little bit of a look at where all this stuff had come from. So here's Devon and Cornwall Police preventing terrorism and extremism. And it says, what can you do? Let's bring that up on screen. There's no typical profile of what kind of person is at risk from being drawn into violent extremism. Anybody, could be anybody, Mike, right? We do know that family, friends and other professionals are the first people to notice early warning signs that an individual is becoming involved in violent extremism. 4-year-olds, for example. Let us know of individuals you feel are susceptible to being drawn into violent extremist activity, so that early, appropriate and effective support can be arranged. Likewise, tell us about individuals who are promoting violent extremism. Now, I just looked at the smiling faces at the top of that, all lovely, caring people, and I think there's a very, very cynical, this is NLP, this is the nudge here, which is we're kind, friendly people, and we'd like you to spy on each other. This is absolutely in your face, and I think it's appropriate that we bring this in, because when the UK column team reported the abuse of a baby boy 3 or 4 years ago. This is a little boy who'd been taken by South Wales Social Services and subjected not to sexual abuse that we know of, but certainly physical abuse. We went into a Plymouth police station to report that abuse with photographs as supporting evidence, and we were treated, well, I'm having trouble choosing some words, but the police officer extremely aggressive and ended up shouting for us to get out of his interview room. So no action was ever taken by Devon and Cornwall Police to protect that child. We've asked the question there, why? I think we know, don't we? The police are protecting the abusers. So if we bring the language in, this was a comment sent through to us with a link to Common Purpose. And the viewer's comment was effectively that not even Lenin and Stalin could get this far. Now remember that David Cameron has been a very strong supporter of Common Purpose, even attending their meetings in India, while Eric Pickles, as then Minister for Communities, was saying that the public shouldn't waste public money on it. We've got now Common Purpose, here it is, thought leadership. So this is exactly what you're talking about. And of course, what is Common Purpose been promoting? That people in the public sector should lead beyond their authority. So this is the real agenda that's starting to rip the country apart. And of course, it's one of the sources for this new speak language, including the creation that we've now got of hate speech thought crime.
Okay, well, perhaps one of the biggest thought crimes that's going on at the moment is the EU referendum, PSYOP, as we like to call it, and it is a psychological operation. And Telegraph here covering the live, well, they're speculating that Cameron's going to make a speech today. If he hasn't already done it, he certainly hadn't before we came on air, which would give ministers a free vote on the upcoming referendum. So it looks like they're angling to have the renegotiation between Britain and the EU complete by February and the referendum later this year. So they're looking at just several months of campaigning. So hopefully that will be the case, a pretty short campaign. And Andrew Mitchell, of course, he came out to make a comment, and he told BBC that it's the obvious decision to take. It means we can all support the PM on his renegotiation. So I'm not quite clear how Andrew Mitchell does that. So it's a free vote. You can vote on your conscience, but it means that everyone can support the Prime Minister.
That's newspeak, Mike.
Well, clearly.
It's acting outside your silo, transformation for the new, new world order. Yes. So just let's remind ourselves. We said it's obvious. It's the obvious decision to take to give MPs a free vote. It means we can all support the PM on his renegotiation. Once the deal is on the table, then every MP can follow their conscience and collective responsibility on this issue ends. So I'm not quite sure how he manages that, but anyway. Not everybody's quite so happy. Christopher Hope has said that a former senior Tory minister who wants to stay in the EU, that's probably Ken Clarke, I suppose, said that it was crazy for Cameron to offer a free vote on this. Maybe David Cameron's been taking advice from Jeremy Corbyn. We'll come on to that in a moment. But in the meantime, this morning, David Cameron has been on a building site. No, sorry, that's a typo there. Brian admits to say I'm in Barking, is what he was in Barking. And he was talking about the things that they're going to do. And apparently the third thing they're going to do is genuinely groundbreaking, because the government on sites that it owns is going to directly commission housing. Now, we were talking about this. This has been sort of drifting around the news for a couple of days, and we were talking about this yesterday. And I mean, this is, what is this, communist? National socialism? Which is it? It's that the government builds housing for people, or is it just some kind of corporate commercial decision that we're going to build houses and then sell them at London rates to first-time buyers? I think it's corporate fascism is what it is. But we're seeing the government's effectively starting to deal in 5-year plans. We're dealing in these plans over a number of years. That's straight out of the communist book. But this appears to me, because they always do it in partnership with the big corporate construction companies. This is corporate fascism.
Well, I wonder how much he got paid for having a Bellway hat on.
Don't know. Perhaps they paid him in bacon.
Possibly.
Well, I think it was Lordy has come up with a comment in our chat box saying that in the housing and planning bill today, they've stopped essentially council houses for life. So that used to be one of the stabilising factors, that if you had a council house, you were secure in that house for life. And in many cases, the house was passed on to future generations. That has now gone out of the door. Why do they want to get rid of that security? Because, of course, the new housing associations are already implementing rules that if you don't do as we say, we're going to evict you from your house. So smoke in the house or have a dispute with your neighbour, there may be a perfectly good reason for that. Housing association is going to remove you, dare to speak out about child abuse, as Melanie Shaw did, and her local Nottingham Housing Association said, well, we're not going to house you. They appear to have changed their mind on that at the moment, but the distress it caused was immense.
Of course, this is also part of the privatisation agenda, and housing associations themselves starting to be privatised, and the whole system being privatised. And I mean, the final remark on this: would you buy a house from the government?
I don't think so, Mike. No. Well, what is also happening, of course, is the massive movement of people, and certainly I'll say I personally believe this is behind the government's so-called focus on house building, because they know that there's going to be a massive movement of people across Europe and into Britain. And as always, the bit we're focusing on, why is this really being done? We should be looking at the sheer treason by our own government and not accusing the people who've been invited into the country. But we get some good clues. What better place to go than the Guardian? And they ran this article by Natalie Nougarade, if I pronounce that properly. She's an interesting lady. She was involved with Le Monde and another French newspaper with Marxist origins. The name will come to me. But I think we can say she's a pretty extreme left-wing radical. In the article, one of the things she says, is there a way to explore the notion of being hyphenated Europeans, Turkish, German, Algerian, French, Asian, British? So we don't really want those nation states. We're just going to become sort of hyphenated newspeak labels. And if you really want to understand her, have a look at her opening paragraph. If Europe's big test in 2015 was the refugee crisis, integrating the newly arrived will be 2016's. This will require the "we can do it" message of Chancellor Angela Merkel. And then the refugee crisis has highlighted a historical fact: Europe's cultural, ethnic and religious diversity will increase in a transformative way in the years and decades to come, which makes it a good time to also open a healthier, more cool-headed debate about our collective identity. Do you know what your collective identity is, Mike?
No.
No. Well, I think what it means...
You have to be multifaceted in your...
Multifaceted collective identity, which means you're going to be European supranational state. And if you have a look at the real push she's got here for propaganda on this, she says, if a promising dynamic can be created, it must come from civil society. There's the common purpose speak, big society. And serious media organisations have a role to play. Now is the time to launch a pan-European citizens' debate on diversity. This woman is talking about the destruction of the nation state. And what are they doing? How are they doing it? They're doing it on the back of the suffering of all of these refugees who are now moving across Europe, and of course many coming into UK. This is a political agenda being floated off the back of the suffering of people leaving war zones, which we created. Does that make me a hate preacher?
Possibly.
Possibly.
Maybe in Cabbage Patch Doll's eyes, in any case.
Indeed, yeah.
Well, change of subject then. Simon Danczuk coming under increasing pressure, and now we have an historic rape allegation made against him. So this is apparently an event which happened in 2006, and the police have said, according to the BBC here, we're in the very early stages of an investigation and inquiries are ongoing. And he has said that this is malicious, untrue and upsetting. Well, I suppose it has to be seen in the context of the sexting scandal which is going on at the moment as well. Of course, he's not denying this. He did it, so he can't really deny it. But what's interesting is in this little interview that he did with LBC this morning, that he is saying that he's not ruling out that he was basically drawn into this behaviour, that it was a bit of a setup, and he's attempting to downplay it by saying that in the history of parliamentary sex scandals, this will be a footnote, if that. He then tried to compare himself to Boris Johnson and suggested that his treatment over this whole thing has been somewhat different than perhaps if he had been from Boris Johnson's background and class and so on. Don't want to really make any comment about the allegations because, of course, there's an ongoing police investigation. But it's pretty clear that he has been the recipient of some pretty horrendous pressure over the last 6 to 12 months. While I can't apologise for what he's done, which was at best utterly stupid, with regard to the sexting thing at least. None of us knows how we would behave under these circumstances, I think.
Well, this is true, Mike. I mean, let's remember that this man did a lot of very good work a few months ago, even before that, in exposing the abuse of children and the clear connections with parliamentary and establishment abusers. He came under a huge amount of pressure as a result of doing that. It took enormous courage at the time. And then here he is under a massive attack. Remarkable, isn't it, that the police can now investigate Mr. Danczuk. They can't investigate any of the abuse survivors who speak out about their abuse. No, we haven't got time to do that. Operation Daybreak in Nottingham around the Beechwood and 7 other children's homes, that's absolutely stagnated, but the police can wade in straight away with an investigation around Danczuk. It's in our faces what is going on here, which is a massive state cover-up of the abuse of children.
It definitely stinks, yes. Now, of course, Danczuk is a big critic of Jeremy Corbyn, as are quite a number, and he has been, well, as the Telegraph says here, reshuffling. The attacks continue on the man. He's never getting a chance to get his feet under the table, really. It's just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, according to the Telegraph. Well, just before we came on air, up until that point, there had only been one casualty of the reshuffle so far, and that was Michael Dewar, MP, who tweeted out this morning, just been sacked by Jeremy Corbyn. I wished him a happy new year. And he also said Jeremy didn't like the things I'd been writing in defence of good colleagues and new politics. Well, here it is. And so he pointed everybody at this thing that he had put out on the 30th of December. Really, I don't think there's anybody in the Parliamentary Labour Party that should be surprised if Jeremy Corbyn's attempting to get some people around him that might be willing to support his agenda. And those that are being pushed sideways because they've been pretty disloyal in the last 6 months, well, they shouldn't be surprised they're getting pushed away, but of course they're getting the massive public mainstream media coverage.
Yeah. Well, we just end on the subject of transparency, or probably opaqueness. This was sent through to us this morning. Basically, it's part of a Freedom of Information request, which has been going in order to get the Cabinet Office to actually declare the names of the people who've actually been awarding peerages. This was an issue that came of immense importance around Jimmy Savile, when nobody wanted to declare how he was nominated for his award and who did it. But since then, it's become clear that the Cabinet Office simply does not want to give the names of the individuals who are putting people forward for the awards. So this is David Cameron's Transparent Conservative Party. Of course, that was championed by Common Purpose supporter Francis Maude. But the facts here are clearly that they don't want to give the information out. But what the government can do, if we say, well, what can they do? Well, they can review the transparency and accountability of students' unions, because that's pretty important that the government gets into control of students' unions. But we don't want to tell the public how we wasted their money giving out gongs to people who are clearly unsuitable. Hypocrisy is just mind-blowing, Mike, but also very dangerous because, of course, if you're going to build a dictatorship, you've got to make sure that you hide the truth from the public at every level.
Yes.
And we've still got the Jack Straw-led review of Freedom of Information going on while we speak. So I expect we can anticipate that the government will be closing down on information for the public in due course. Silence. Well, we're 2 days into UK column news reporting on what's happening in UK at the moment. And I'm sorry to say we're really having to up the warnings that we are moving into a British dictatorship extremely quickly. Where's the evidence? Right in front of our eyes. But just think of the implications of Ian Crane detained for 1 hour at Exeter Airport, interrogated as if he is an extremist in some terrorist organisation. What is his real crime? That he has exposed the immense damage that David Cameron's fracking campaign can and is doing across UK. So how do we stop this? Well, it comes down to everybody speaking out and warning family, friends, individuals of the reality. Where are the most dangerous people in Britain at the moment? We believe that they're in Westminster. How can we change the situation? Well, we need a change of MPs. And as we always say, that can be done when enough people simply say, we're not going to put up with the breed of MPs that we've got in Westminster at the moment. We'll end there. Thank you very much for all the emails of support we have had in, and also thank you very much for those of you who've donated. If you haven't taken out a subscription with UK Column, please do. We're looking for an update really in facilities, which we will be talking about fairly shortly, but we can only do what we do with your help and support. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.